By manager level role, I mean a role in which some of the attributions will be managing people or managing teams of people. And needless to say, these are pretty senior roles. And for example, at Amazon, this is when the leadership principle, hire and develop the best, comes into play, is more significant than in other types of roles. There's both a difference in the questions getting asked, but also in how they are asked. And for example, if I'd ask you, tell me about the time when you failed, the question is pretty straightforward. But if I'd ask you, have you had any major failures recently? It's not as straightforward to understand. I'm asking you about the time when you failed, although arguably the same examples could essentially fit into both of these scenarios. Now, I'm going to split these examples of questions that I'm going to exemplify next into two sections. First, I've noticed these getting asked in phone interviews, and the second during the on-site interviews. So during the phone screen, a very common scenario is for senior or for very senior roles is to have a question about the failure and then to simply develop on that failure for half an hour or 45 minutes. So be prepared to remember as much detail as possible from your main highlights from your career, both positive and negative, because it's a perfectly viable scenario that you would have to talk about one event for the entire time. Another possible question could be a rather general one. How do you start your day, and what keeps you motivated in your day-to-day job? And it is a very relevant question in order to express your motivation and your way of thinking about motivation. Next example would be, how do you prioritize your workload? And needless to say that you must find an example here of a time when you had some challenging event that required you serious prioritization. How do you go about that? Another example of question during a phone interview would be, how do you manage managers and indirect reports, and how often do you communicate with them? And this should basically this is basically asking you for a management style and how do you go about these things. So of course you want to avoid hypothetical answers as much as possible. So you would want, whenever you would feel like you want to go hypothetical, you would ideally have to link that to a specific example into which you applied whatever management style you have. And finally, the last question I wanted to touch upon for a phone interview would be, tell me about an interesting project that you had. So this is equivalent, what's your most successful project, or what's the project that you're the most proud of? And this is something I usually call as gift questions, because you don't have to prepare a lot for a phone interview, and I don't recommend anyone to prepare that much for a phone interview, but this is the type of question that would highlight what you're best at, and you should, in my opinion, prepare this one in advance. Next, for the on-site interview, there's plenty of questions you might get asked, and I believe you have tons of examples online, but some of the more interesting ones that I know would be, tell me about the time when you fired someone, or tell me about the time when you had set a challenging yet achievable goal for your team, or tell me about the time when you encouraged a team member to take on a significant risk, or tell me about the time when you set a vision when there wasn't one, and how did you get buy-in for this vision, for your own vision? Or tell me about the time when you felt like your team was not progressing quickly enough, and explain your approach and the outcome. Tell me about the time when you had to decide on whether to ask for additional resources for a project. What was the outcome? Tell me about the time when you helped a team member to achieve a significant goal, and what was the outcome? Now, as some closing remarks here would be that usually in a job interview, you always want to focus on your strengths, and it's also true that positivity sells. However, what I found is the more senior the role, also there's also the opportunity, the increased opportunity of highlighting the behavior that you or the idea that you want to transmit, not only through positive stories but also through negative ones. So even if the question would be what's your most challenging project, I would very much challenge you to think of a story that's not necessarily a positive one. It doesn't have to be a happy ending for this story, so long as it would highlight on your ability to prioritize things, to manage business, to get your job done with the best possible quality. So if there's one clear difference between behavioral interviewing for more junior roles and for manager level roles, is that for manager level roles, it's no longer about. It's all about not templating your answers in a given format that sells well, but rather a format that exhibits your core strengths, either through a positively framed or negatively framed story. And even further, I would even encourage you to reconsider the templating your answers in a star format or a par format or whatever format there is, because it's oftentimes that by not templating your answers is that you get the best possible way to communicate your own stories. So I also found this strategy of not templating anything or thinking what would be the best way to communicate a certain behavior to be a very important part of preparing both a telephone screen but more significantly an on-site behavioral interview for a manager level role.